Frank, welcome to this series of conversations about the big issues that are going to determine what sort of society we hand on to our kids and our grandchildren. You're an eminent intellectual from the United Kingdom. You spend quite a bit of time in Australia. You and I come from probably, in traditional terms anyway, the way they might be described, different political perspectives. And yet it seems we're in furious agreement on two things that we think would be critical to the future of our society. One is the way in which we socialise our children, the environment in which they grow up in and who accepts responsibility for it and how it's carried forward. The other is that we have to ensure that we rediscover and lock down what we once understood about a respectful public debate.
Yeah, I think that's crucially important, that the socialization of the younger generation is the responsibility of their parents. They're the ones that are responsible for them. They're the ones that have to live with the consequences of their action. They're the ones that are intimately involved and really understand what makes their children tick. And even the most sophisticated expert with millions of PhD degrees is not really able to understand the context within which a child grows up. And what I'm really worried about is that we've tended to professionalize child rearing. We're asking experts and teachers and social workers to make judgment calls about young people. And even with the best will in the world, they basically approach young people with a pre-existing formula, template, which very often doesn't correspond to the real needs of children. So I'm very firmly of the opinion that the battle for socializing kids by parents is a non-negotiable issue.
And yet we see this enormous push to almost enlist the state at this early stage as co-parents, if you like, towards what seems to be a drift in the direction of the state knows best, the nanny state, as many Australians would call it.
Yes, or in Britain we call it the politics of behaviour, where there's an assumption that most parents are too stupid or lack the intellectual resources to know what's in the best interest of their child. And for that reason, you have to bring in all these other people to give their opinion. And what that simply forgets is that for thousands of years, people, ordinary people without any education, almost intuitively understood what their children needs. Most parents, 99.9% of them, act with the best possible intentions. And it seems to me that if you disrupt that relationship between a child and a parent, you don't just simply disrupt it temporarily, you undermine that organic dynamic that you need to have for the sake of the child developing in a mature, independent way. And that's what I'm really worried about with the present trends.
I think I read somewhere that you'd said something to the effect that the greatest mistake the West has made is to deconstruct its families.
I didn't actually say that precisely, but I do think that we've become very uncomfortable with the family. I know that families have a lot of problems, that even if you're well off, sometimes you struggle. Relationships are often facing all kinds of challenges. But at the end of the day, the family is the only unit that we have that can effectively bring children up. More importantly, the only unit that we have that can take responsibility for the long-term future of a child, which is why we see so often when children are taken into care, children are taken into homes, even when the people that look after them have the best of intentions, they're not able to assume the same kind of responsibility. They're not in a position to guarantee the welfare of that child in the long run than a mother or a father whose commitment is for life.
So, just to tease that out in a slightly Australian context, you come here often, you know the country amazingly well. You obviously have an affection for Australia. I sometimes say of Australia, we're of the West, but we're not in it. In many ways, we're one of the youngest of the Western countries, we're least encumbered by debt. We probably have some of the best prospects of any country in the West. But if our future is our children, how do you feel about these trends that you're talking about playing out in Australia?
Well, I see some very important battles ahead. I think one of the nice things about Australia is there is a certain basic fundamental decency that you detect just by interacting with people on the street. When I have conversations with the people that I bump into, I'm very often astonished by the kind of strong sense of character and optimism that they project. I understand that there are other kind of Australians as well. Not everybody has that kind of robust, resilient attitude towards the future that many ordinary Australians have. But what I'm concerned about is that at the moment in Australia, you have a situation where on the one hand, unlike in many other Western societies, you still got that fairly resilient attitude towards the future, this capacity and a desire to make things happen. But at the same time, we also have a kind of cultural elite or cultural oligarchy who's very contemptuous of the ordinary Australian, which I often detect, especially when I talk to some of my academic colleagues. They always talk about the other Australia as this alien territory, where you got these natives who have all these apparent prejudices and who for some reason are not prepared to sign up to their way of life. And I think what worries me is that their influence, if it remains unchecked, can create a potentially quite an unhealthy dynamic. Because unless the ordinary people of Australia get a bit more confident voice in the public domain, in the political domain, people that actually are organically linked to them and be able to express their views and sentiments, we may have some trouble in the future.